Welcome to the fourth and final video in our series on the formal elements. This one explores space and perspective. There are several different types of space that we refer to within art, and the most prominent of these is three-dimensional space, which means that something has either mass or volume and occupies actual space, so the real world. Types of art that have three-dimensional space include architecture, sculpture, things that you can actually physically touch and occupy the real world. A work of art such as sculpture or architecture can be walked around, touched, and are part of the same world that you and I occupy. Two-dimensional space refers to a flat use of space, which occupies a visual element. It is not something that is necessarily actually there, but something that is implied typically. And so painting, drawing, and printing are all examples of two-dimensional space within art. They exist really only within the context of the image's surface, which is known as the picture plane. So for example, here in Doho Su's reflection, we see the contrast between three-dimensional and two-dimensional space. The lower half is a three-dimensional work of art made of very finely connected strings that are hung from the ceiling and running across the whole room. The string and the lights above it create a highly reflective surface and then produce the illusion of a second structure above. So the image below, you see this kind of temple archway. That is something that you could physically walk around, you could touch it, it's really there in the space. But above, in that reflected surface that is again made of string, you see a second archway. That archway is not actually there. That archway occupies a two-dimensional space, but creates the implication of three-dimensionality. And you can only see that particular image through the reflection. Perspective refers to the creation of depth within a two-dimensional space by accounting for size and the distance of one object from another. There are several different types of perspective we're going to talk about. The oldest and simplest to draw of these is isometric perspective. In isometric perspective, images have no fixed viewpoint, meaning there is no one particular spot that you are supposed to look at the image or from which you are supposed to see the image. In isometric perspective, artists use diagonal lines to convey receding space, often creating objects that are unrealistically sized in relation to one another. Isometric perspective was really common during the Renaissance and in Far Eastern art, where the standards of realistic perspective were either not known or not considered important. So in these images by the Limburg brothers of Les Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, or the Book of Hours of the Duc de Berry, we see a variety of different types of isometric perspective. If you look at the far left image, we have these very large figures in the foreground, contrasted by a very, very small castle in the background. And you also see on the right the image of a castle wall, and you can see into the castle from an aerial perspective, when really if you're seeing these figures from a frontal perspective, you shouldn't also be able to see an aerial perspective at the same time. So there's no particular spot from which you're supposed to view this. The sense of size and proportion is all off. You still get the sense of what the image is about. You have these figures in a very wealthy palace, but it doesn't really make sense from perspective point of view. And the other images are similar, although the one in the center gets the closest to having a realistic perspective. Linear perspective is really considered the epitome of what perspective should be. It is dependent on a fixed viewpoint, meaning that you're really only seeing from one perspective. And as an image recedes, parallel lines converge at a vanishing point along an established horizon line. So if you think about in the real world, if you're driving down a highway, as far as you can see, the road eventually meets the sky. That's the horizon line. And so that is actually an important element of creating a realistic, believable linear perspective. Everything converges on that vanishing point along the horizon line. It was perfected as a perspective during the Italian Renaissance and really changed completely the expectation of high art. Once linear perspective was discovered, it was really expected that everyone was going to use it. And for the most part, that happened for a very long time. In this image by Pietro Perugino of Christ delivering the keys to St. Peter, we see an ideal example of linear perspective. There is a clear horizon line. You see all the way along the back here where the ground meets the sky. And there is a very clear focal point right in the center of the horizon line, which is this doorway right in the middle with these two figures in it. Everything in the image, the figures, the buildings, everything is sized realistically in proportion to their distance from the focal point. So for example, the figures in the foreground are the largest, which makes sense. The figures in the midground, this second layer, are believably smaller than the figures in the foreground. The size of the buildings makes sense in relation to the figures, and these figures that are in the far distance, either right in the center or right along the horizon line, are much smaller and are in proportion with the size of the buildings that they stand next to. Everything really converges around the focal point within the middle here, this vanishing point. So if you look in the very foreground, we see Christ on the left, St. Peter on the right, and Christ is giving the keys to heaven to St. Peter. The key is directly in line with the vanishing point or the focal point. And then there are also lines physically drawn within the image that guide your eye to that vanishing point. So if you look at the lines in the pavement, these carry the eye backwards right here. And everything above the horizon line also helps guide the eye back to the vanishing point. So you could physically draw a line from the top of these buildings right down to that vanishing point. So it is very symmetrical, it is very balanced, but the use of perspective is also really, really ideal. You don't always find images that are this clear, but this particular one makes the use of linear perspective really, really easy to understand. There is another aspect of linear perspective that's really important, and this is known as foreshortening. Foreshortening is a visual phenomenon whereby elongated images are projected away or towards the viewer to appear shorter than their actual length. And this implies the use of three-dimensional space. So in Hans Baldung's Groom and the Witch, the figure in the foreground is laying horizontally, but there are aspects of his body that have been truncated to create the illusion of depth. So for example, we see the bottom of his feet here, and there's this implication of his legs behind that, but you really only see a very small portion of the legs. The proportion of his thighs to his upper body is actually not anatomically accurate. His thigh would not be quite as large as his torso. But because of this perspective that we're seeing of everything being shortened to create the implication of depth, it all becomes believable. Then if you look at the horse in the background, the horse's body is actually really tiny, but there is this illusion that the horse goes back much further than you can actually see him. And so foreshortening is really important within any work of art to really make sure that you can believe that space is receding again into the background towards the horizon line. A sort of continuation of linear perspective is called atmospheric perspective, which relies on the basic principles of linear perspective, but is also based on the observation that distant objects in nature appear hazier, paler, and bluer than objects that are nearby as a result of a scattered light through atmospheric moisture. So in Albert Bierstadt's Rocky Mountains, there's a difference in the colors below or just above the horizon line, and anything at the higher elevation of the mountains in the distance. Above the horizon line, we see a sort of mistier pastel color palette in contrast to the bold, lifelike colors in the foreground. So this is something that's actually a real effect in nature due to atmospheric changes. And in a painting, it makes the landscape appear a lot more realistic. So in the foreground here, we have this encampment of figures next to a lake. The colors are all really bold. There's a lot of detail to it. It all feels very true to life. We can see the horizon line here where the water meets the sky. There's mountains above the horizon line, but then as you get further and further up, there's a delineation here between the true color and this sort of hazier. And this is because we're looking suddenly high up in the mountains. It's the same as if you were going up in an airplane, suddenly everything becomes a little bit mistier and bluer as you get high up in the sky. Following the invention of linear perspective during the Renaissance, there was relatively little that changed within art regarding perspective until the 20th century. So if you think about it from about the 14th or 15th century all the way to the 20th century, things were pretty much the same. And then Pablo Picasso and his friend Georges Braque became responsible for what is really the most significant break in artistic standards up until that time. And they really paved the way for modern artists to perceive the canvas differently. So in the early 20th century, Picasso and Braque began playing with the realism of the canvas, ignoring the belief that the canvas should really reflect reality, which had been a strongly held belief since the Renaissance. Instead, they broke images down into tiny geometric fragments that really only vaguely resembled aspects of the original images. They then pieced these images back together, not fully reassembling the original image, but still allowing bits of it to show through. So this style is known as analytic cubism, and to achieve it, they removed most of the color and detail of an image, focusing instead on what actually makes an image. This allowed them as artists to show an image from multiple perspectives within the same image, within the same canvas. And in many senses, analytic cubism really shattered the formal picture plane that artists had relied on for centuries, rebuilding a new realm of art where perspective was less relevant. So in this image here of the portrait of Ambroise Vollard, you can see these tiny little geometric shapes, triangles, rectangles, unusual shapes, but all vaguely geometric. In the center at the top, you can see the basic shape of a head, but you're seeing him from multiple perspectives at once. So you can see from the top, the side, the front, the bottom, all of these perspectives are all there together at once. So it creates a sense of three-dimensionality, but it is also the illusion of it. That isn't really three-dimensional. And then as you get further away from his face, it becomes less and less realistic. So there's potentially a shirt and tie down here, maybe the implication of hands, but the reality of the perspective is no longer as important as the ability to kind of break up an image and remake it as they want. They get rid of color because they find color distracting. They want to just focus on the forms of the image. What are the most necessary components for an image to exist? Following the invention of analytic cubism, Picasso continued to push the boundaries of perspective within his painting, and his subsequent style, known as synthetic cubism, exists in a post-analytic world where the traditional linear perspective no longer really matters. Traditional aspects of painting, such as the horizon line, focal points, foreground, background, and scaling, are not really relevant within synthetic cubism. So in this style, Picasso reintroduced color to his work. He's already taken it out. He's found the basic tenets of an image. You can add color back in, but maintains the use of geometric shapes, and they are larger and less focused than before. These images have enough connection to recognizable imagery that viewers can make some sense of what they're seeing, but they cannot really apply traditional rules of painting. So in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, or the Ladies of Avignon, Picasso gives us an image that has really no grounding. You don't know where these figures are. There's nothing in the background to contextualize it for you. There are 5 basic figures, some of whom look somewhat vaguely human, others who have these sort of warped faces. Their body language their bodies are very blocky and not necessarily very refined the way that traditionally painted images are. There's also this incorporation of kind of a fruit arrangement that seems like it's kind of literally falling off the canvas. So there is no grounding, there's no foreground, there's no background, there's no focal point. These images truly just exist on the canvas, and their relation to reality is very, very warped. So between the transition from analytic to synthetic cubism, Picasso has essentially taken away all of the basic things that originally held an image together.